The old hospital loomed ahead, a grim silhouette against the backdrop of an overcast sky. Its reputation preceded it tales of ghostly apparitions, chilling screams echoing through the halls at night, and the eerie presence of long-dead nurses tending to invisible patients. For years I had heard the stories, each one more terrifying than the last. I never thought I'd find myself within its walls, but here I was, standing at the threshold of terror. I am a paranormal investigator, driven by curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth behind supernatural phenomena. My name is Alex, and I have encountered many haunted places in my career, but nothing had prepared me for the horrors that awaited inside the abandoned hospital. When I first heard about the hospital, my interest was piqued. The stories of ghost nurses intrigued me, and I decided to investigate, not knowing that this journey would forever alter my perception of the paranormal. As I approached the hospital, I felt a chill run down my spine. The building was a monolithic structure of decaying bricks and broken windows, surrounded by overgrown weeds that seemed to whisper in the wind. The entrance, once grand, was now a gaping maw of darkness, inviting and menacing at the same time. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and every step I took echoed ominously through the empty halls. That first night, the hospital felt like a living entity, aware of my presence and watching my every move. As I set up my equipment in one of the old patient rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe or the distant creak of old metal. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to come from just beyond the doorway. I gathered my courage and followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I turned a corner and saw her for the first time, a nurse, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, standing at the end of the hall. Her eyes were hollow, her face a mask of sorrow. As I approached, she vanished into thin air, leaving me alone and shaken. The next day, I decided to delve into the hospital's history. What I discovered was a story steeped in tragedy and loss. The hospital had been built in the early 1900s and had served as a tuberculosis sanatorium during its early years. Many patients had died within its walls, and it was said that some of the nurses had been so dedicated to their patients that they continued their duties even after death. I spoke to former patients and staff who confirmed the stories. They recounted tales of ghostly nurses appearing at bedsides, administering care to the living and dead alike. One former patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, told me of her experience during her stay in the hospital. I remember waking up one night, she said, her voice trembling. There was a nurse standing by my bed. She looked just like the nurses from the old photographs, and she was holding my hand. But when I blinked, she was gone. I never felt so cold in my life. As I listened to these stories, I felt a growing sense of dread. The hospital's past was filled with suffering and death, and it seemed that some of the spirits had never found peace. Over the next few nights, the paranormal activity escalated. The ghostly nurses appeared more frequently, their presence growing stronger and more malevolent. I saw them in the hallways, drifting silently through the air, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of sadness and anger. I heard their whispers, pleading for help, but when I tried to respond, they would vanish, leaving only the cold air and the echo of their voices behind. One night, I was reviewing footage from my cameras when I heard a loud crash from the floor above. I rushed upstairs to find a gurney overturned, its wheels still spinning. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. Just the lingering sense of a presence, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone in my experiences. Others who had dared to enter the hospital spoke of similar encounters. A fellow investigator named Sarah described how she had seen a nurse standing in the operating room, her eyes locked onto hers. She looked so real, Sarah said, her voice shaking. But when I reached out to touch her, my hand went right through. I felt this overwhelming sadness, like all the pain and suffering she had witnessed was pouring into me. The haunting reached its peak one night when I encountered a nurse who seemed different from the others. Her uniform was stained with blood, and her eyes were filled with a terrifying rage. She appeared in the old surgery wing, where countless patients had met their end. As I stood frozen in fear, She moved towards me, her hand outstretched. I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if her touch was burning through my very soul. That night marked a turning point in my investigation. I realized that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a group of paranormal experts who specialized in haunted locations. They agreed to join me for one final attempt to confront the ghostly nurses and put an end to the haunting. We gathered all the tools we could think of: EMF meters, thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and even a few items blessed by a local priest. We were determined to uncover the truth and, if possible, help the restless spirits find peace. The night was tense, every creak and groan of the old building setting our nerves on edge. As we ventured deeper into the hospital, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. In the operating room, where I had experienced the most intense encounter, we set up our equipment and began our vigil. Hours passed with little activity, and we were starting to lose hope when the atmosphere changed. The room grew colder, and a mist began to form around us. Out of the fog, the ghostly nurses emerged, their faces twisted in anguish. The lead expert, Dr. Evans, began speaking to them, offering words of comfort and assurance. As he spoke, the mist thickened, and the nurses seemed to listen, their expressions softening. But then the nurse with the blood-stained uniform appeared, her rage palpable. She screamed, a sound that echoed through the halls, causing the very walls to tremble. We stood our ground, determined not to flee. Dr. Evans continued speaking, his voice steady and calm. Slowly, the nurse's rage began to subside, replaced by a look of profound sadness. She reached out, not in anger this time, but in a plea for help. Doctor. Evans took a step forward, extending his hand. As their hands met, the room was filled with a blinding light. When it faded, the ghostly figures were gone. The air was still and calm, the oppressive energy lifted. The hospital was never the same after that night. The ghostly nurses had found some measure of peace, and the paranormal activity diminished significantly. I left the hospital with a new respect for the spirits that linger in our world, their stories waiting to be told. The experience had a profound impact on me. I had always been fascinated by the paranormal, but this investigation taught me that behind every haunting is a story of human suffering and a desire for closure. The ghost nurses of the hospital were not malevolent entities, but souls trapped by their own dedication and tragedy. I continued my work as a paranormal investigator, but I approached each case with a deeper sense of empathy and respect. The haunted hospital was a place of horror, but it was also a place where I learned the true nature of the spirits that walk among us. And in the end, it was a place where I discovered that even in death, there is a need for understanding and compassion. The haunted hospital remains a place of mystery, but for those who dare to enter its halls, it is a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that the spirits of the departed are never far from our world.